I woke up alone with 3 broken ribs after my family disappeared for 5 days. When my sister finally came back and asked if I'd been discharged, the nurse's one-line answer left her frozen in shock. When I first opened my eyes, there was a tube down my throat and I could not scream. In the middle of that panic, I remember thinking one thing with perfect clarity: nobody was holding my hand. That is the detail that stayed with me. Not the pain and not the machine beeping above my head as if it were annoyed that I had woken up. It was the empty chair. My sister, Margot, had sat in that chair for exactly 20 minutes on the first night, long enough to sign a form saying she would not be financially responsible for me, and then she left. I did not know any of that yet. All I knew was that the chair was empty, that it had been empty for a long time, and that some animal part of my brain understood what that meant before the rest of me could catch up. My name is Asia Apprentice. I was 29 years old and would turn 30 in 6 weeks, a fact that mattered far more than I could have imagined. This is the story of how my own sister tried to have me killed for $2.3 million, and how a nurse with a night shift logbook became one of the reasons she was finally caught. 3 weeks before the crash, my life was boring in the particular way that only feels boring while you still have it. I worked as a project coordinator for a mid-size engineering firm outside Millbrook, and I drove a used Honda Accord with 61,000 miles on it. I rented a downstairs apartment with bad water pressure and a good view of a maple tree that I liked more than I liked most people. Every Tuesday, after dinner at my parents' house, I drove home on Route 7. It was always the same curve, the same guardrail, and the same 45 miles per hour I had driven 1,000 times without giving it a thought. My family was never warm, exactly. My mother, Diane, ran the house like a small, tense country that Margot had been born to inherit. My father, Walter, mostly agreed with whatever Margot said, the way a man agrees with the weather. Margot was 3 years older than me, married to a real estate developer named Brett Holloway, and had spent her whole life being the daughter my parents introduced first at parties. I did not hate her for it. I want to be honest about that, because this story only makes sense if you understand that I was not looking for a villain. I had made peace with being the background character in my own family. I had my job, my apartment, and my maple tree. I did not need to be anyone's favorite. The Tuesday before the crash, dinner seemed completely normal. Margot brought a bottle of wine that she never opened. Almost lazily, she asked what I was doing for my birthday. I told her nothing special. Turning 30 was not a milestone I cared much about. She smiled in a way I did not think about again until much later and said, "It's a big one for you though. Trust stuff and everything." I should have noticed that phrase, trust stuff. Nobody says something like that unless they have already been thinking about it. I parked in my parents' driveway that night, as I always did. Margot stayed behind after I said goodbye, supposedly to help Mom reorganize a closet. According to the doorbell camera timestamp I later requested, she remained there for 3 hours. 3 hours beside my car, with nothing to show for it except a closet that, as far as I ever heard, was never reorganized. The next night, I drove home the same way I always did, Route 7, the curve by the reservoir. It was 11:52 p.m. I remember the radio playing. I remember touching the brakes on the downslope without thinking, the way your foot knows the pedal better than your brain does. Nothing happened. I pressed again. Still nothing. The pedal sank all the way to the floor, with no more resistance than a sheet of paper. In the 2 or 3 seconds I had to understand anything, I realized I was not slowing down. The curve was coming. A guardrail stood ahead of me, and beyond it was a 40-foot drop into the reservoir basin. I hit the guardrail at 45 miles per hour. The airbag broke my nose. 3 ribs snapped like dry branches, and my right lung collapsed on impact. I do not remember the ambulance or the emergency room. I remember someone faintly mentioning my oxygen saturation, and then there was nothing for a long time until the tube and the empty chair. I was intubated for 2 days. When they finally removed the tube and I could speak in a scraped-out whisper, the first thing I asked was whether anyone had come. My nurse was Colleen Ashby, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and the sort of competence that makes you feel safer just by standing near her. "Your sister," Colleen said carefully. "She was here the first night. She signed some paperwork with the billing office." I asked, "How long did she stay?" Colleen checked her tablet, more from habit than necessity, because I think she already knew the answer. 20 minutes. I said nothing. There was nothing I could say that would not have cost me a rib. I did not have to spare. My parents called once. It was a short conversation, and my mother's voice did that thing it always did when she was performing concern for an audience that was not there. They did not come. Nobody came. I lay in that hospital bed with a chest tube and a collapsed lung, receiving more visits from the hospital chaplain, a stranger, than from my own family. On the 3rd day, my friend Danny Ruiz came to see me. Danny and I had known each other since high school. He ran a garage 2 towns over and had repaired my Accord more times than either of us could count. He did not sit down, and he did not hug me because of my ribs. He stood at the foot of the bed with his jaw tight and said, "I went to look at your car. The tow yard let me in." I told him, "Danny, I do not need a lecture about brake pads right now." "It's not the brake pads," he said flatly, as if he had rehearsed the words in his truck so he would not lose his nerve. "Your brake line didn't wear out, Asia. It was cut. Clean and straight, with a tool. Somebody did that on purpose. I laughed, a short, broken sound that hurt my ribs because it sounded like something that happened in someone else's life, not mine. Cut by whom? I don't have enemies, Danny. I have a Honda and a Costco membership. He said, I don't know who did it, but I know what a worn line looks like, and I know what a cut one looks like. This was not an accident. You should call the police today. I did not call the police that day. I want to be honest about that too. I was frightened and exhausted, and some deep, foolish, hopeful part of me did not want it to be true. If it was true, then someone had wanted me dead badly enough to act on it, and the list of people who had access to my car the night before was very, very short. On the fourth day, a woman I had met perhaps twice in my life entered my hospital room, carrying a leather folder and looking as though she had not slept. Helen Marsh had been my grandmother's estate attorney for 11 years and now managed the Prentice Family Trust. My grandmother had built the fund through a lifetime of thrift and a lucky patent on an irrigation valve. It was worth $2.3 million, divided between Margot and me, and my share would vest fully on my 30th birthday. Helen was around 60, silver-haired and so precise that you trusted her before she finished a sentence. I need to tell you something, she said as she sat in the same chair Margot had occupied for 20 minutes and never returned to. And I need you to stay calm because your blood pressure is literally on a monitor. She continued, 2 days ago, before you were even off the ventilator, your sister called my office. She did not ask how you were. She asked what happens to your half of the trust if you are declared incapacitated before your birthday. Beneath the pain of my broken ribs, something in my chest went cold and still. She asked that word for word, Helen said. She did not ask whether you would walk again. She did not ask whether you would wake up. She asked what happens to the money. Her mouth tightened into a thin line. I have managed families through some of the worst moments of their lives, Asia. I have never received a call like that. I lay there and did the calculation I did not want to do. 6 weeks until my birthday. A curve I had driven 1,000 times. A brake line that had not failed but had been cut. A sister who sat beside me for 20 minutes and then called a trust attorney before asking whether I was still breathing. I want a private investigator, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Someone good. Someone who will not tell my parents. Helen nodded as if she had been waiting for me to say it. I know exactly whom to call. Ray Kendall had spent 19 years with the Millbrook Police Department before retiring into private investigation. He was the kind of former detective who still stood as if he expected trouble to come through the doorway. He came to see me the day I left the ICU, notepad already in hand. He wasted no words. I don't do hand-holding, he told me. I find facts. If the facts say your sister is innocent, I will tell you that too, and you will have spent my retainer on peace of mind. That is the deal. I answered, that's fine. I want the truth more than I want her to be guilty. That was true. For whatever it is worth, I want that on the record. I would have chosen relief over vindication on any day of that week. It took Ray 6 days to return with something. He met me at the temporary house where I was staying, a place I will explain in a moment, and set a manila folder on the table, as if it weighed far more than paper should. Home Depot on Route 9, he said. A pair of hydraulic brake line cutters, $34.99, paid for with a Visa ending in 4,471. He slid a printed receipt across the table. That card belongs to Margot Holloway. My hand began to shake before my mind fully processed the sentence. It was not dramatic, just a fine, involuntary tremor that I could not command to stop. They were purchased 3 days before your crash, Ray continued. I obtained the store's exterior camera footage with help from Helen because it was connected to an active brake tampering investigation. 2 nights later, at 11:47 p.m., a woman matching your sister's height and build walked up your parents' driveway toward your car. 17 minutes before that, he said, tapping another page. Brett Holloway called Margot. The call lasted a little over 4 minutes. I asked what they had discussed. Ray replied, I have a private investigator's license, not a wiretap or a warrant for call content, but I spoke to Brett's business partner, Curtis Doyle. I bought him a beer last Thursday. According to Curtis, Brett's real estate fund was underwater by $1.8 million. 2 weeks earlier, Brett had told Margot, fix this, or I'm done. I sat with that for a long moment. I had 3 broken ribs and a chest tube scar. Brett needed $1.8 million, while Margot had access to a trust worth $2.3 million. She was never going to let me turn 30, I said, and the words came out flatter than I expected, more like a fact than a feeling. The feeling was there somewhere beneath the surface. It would arrive later in waves, usually around 3 in the morning. In that moment, however, I felt only intensely awake. I want to be clear, Ray said. What I have is strong circumstantial evidence, a receipt, a grainy image of someone with her build, a phone call timeline, and a motive with a dollar amount attached. That is not enough by itself for a conviction. If we take this to the police today, a competent defense attorney could pick it apart in an afternoon. So we keep building until it is no longer merely circumstantial. Then he looked directly at me. In the meantime, you disappear. If she cut a brake line once and failed, and now you are awake and asking questions, you are more dangerous to her alive than you were 3 weeks ago. Colleen, the night nurse who had told me the truth about those 20 minutes without flinching, had a mother named Ruth. Ruth lived alone on the edge of town in a small house with a wraparound porch and a dog named Biscuit, who disliked almost everyone except, apparently, me. Colleen offered the place before I even asked. "Ruth has the room," she said. "And frankly, I do not like the idea of you returning to an apartment whose address your family knows." I moved in on a Thursday with a duffel bag of clothes that Danny collected from my apartment and a lung that still ached whenever I laughed too hard. Nobody in my family knew where I was. Not my mother, not my father, and not Margot. For the first time in 29 years, I did not call anyone to explain myself or send a group message assuring them I was fine. I simply existed in a stranger's guest room and healed. It was the strangest peace I had ever felt. It was not happiness, exactly. It was more like relief, with the volume turned all the way down. I stopped waiting for my phone to light up with concern from people who had never once asked whether I was breathing properly. I stopped explaining. I just healed. Margot, however, did not slow down. 9 days after the crash, my human resources department called me on the burner phone Ray had arranged. Someone claiming to be my emergency contact had asked what paperwork was required to place me on involuntary medical leave. At first, I told myself it might be innocent. Perhaps Margot was only trying to help. Then I asked HR who had called. They gave me the name Margot Holloway and a callback number that matched her cell phone. She had not called to ask whether I needed leave. She had specifically asked what documentation would be necessary to place an employee on leave without that person's consent, citing incapacity. My stomach seemed to drop somewhere behind my broken ribs. 3 days later, Helen called with something that made my hands shake all over again. A psychiatrist named Dr. Neil Aldrich, a man I had never met, had received a request from Margot for an emergency competency evaluation. She claimed I had behaved erratically since the accident and had made concerning statements about the family. For a moment, I told myself she might genuinely believe I was struggling. Head trauma can make families imagine strange things. Then, at Helen's request, Dr. Aldrich's office forwarded the voicemail. I heard Margot's voice for the first time since the crash, calm and reasonable, using my name alongside the phrases financial decisions and for her own good, as though those words naturally belonged together. My mother called Ruth's landline. I never learned how she found the number, and even now that detail unsettles me more than almost anything else. She left a message explaining that Margot had hosted a family dinner and cried actual tears while telling my parents, an aunt, and 2 cousins that I was pushing everyone away after the accident, that I had become paranoid, and that I was impossible to reach. I told myself, let her talk. The facts do not change because she cries at a dinner table. Then Ray confirmed, through a cousin who still liked me enough to send messages, that my mother had held Margot's hand throughout the performance, my father had nodded along, and nobody in the room had asked to see the accident report. That report stated in plain police language that the brake failure was consistent with mechanical tampering, not ordinary wear. 2 weeks before my birthday, Ray discovered that Margot had contacted Preston Cole, a bank officer and a family friend from her country club. She had asked, hypothetically, what process could freeze a trust disbursement while a beneficiary was under a mental health hold. I told myself she was reaching, becoming careless and desperate. Desperation cuts both ways, because desperate people leave trails. Then Helen explained one particular provision in the trust. Any beneficiary found to have caused, attempted to cause, or conspired to cause harm to another beneficiary would forfeit that person's entire share. Margot did not know the clause existed. I did, because Helen had just told me. In that conversation, I understood with complete clarity that Margot was no longer merely trying to gain more money. She was trying to prevent herself from losing all of it. 10 days before my birthday, Brett Holloway's real estate fund officially defaulted on a construction loan. It was a public filing and easy for Ray to obtain. The fund was $1.8 million underwater, and the lender's attorneys seized the remaining assets. That same week, Margot quietly began listing jewelry on a consignment website under a false name. I told myself that this was a woman coming apart and that I should feel something for her. I did, for about 4 seconds. Then I remembered the receipt for $34.99, the exact amount. It later seemed to me that my life had been worth to her less than a decent dinner out. Every new discovery cost me something, mostly sleep and a little more of the part of me that still wanted to be wrong about her. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from disproving hope 5 separate times in 3 weeks. Nobody warns you about that part. You imagine the 4th or 5th confirmation will be easier, that you will already be numb, hardened, and prepared. It does not work that way. Each time, some small, stubborn part of me reset itself to 0 and whispered that perhaps this piece of evidence had an innocent explanation. Each time Ray's flat voice, reciting dates and dollar amounts, had to talk that part of me down all over again. I began keeping a notebook, not for the investigation because Ray handled that far better than I ever could, but for myself. Each night at Ruth's kitchen table, I wrote a few lines so that one day I could look back and prove I had not imagined any of it. I still have that notebook. I do not read it often. By the time we filed anything formally, 3 named professionals stood behind the evidence. That mattered because none of this could succeed on outrage alone. It worked because everything was documented. Detective Renata Ford, a 14-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department, took over the brake tampering case from a patrol officer who had initially recorded the crash as a routine mechanical failure. Detective Ford personally re-examined the car at the impound lot. She compared Danny's initial assessment with the findings of the department's forensic mechanic and confirmed that the cut was consistent with a bolt cutter or a hydraulic line shear. It was not corrosion, road debris, or the sort of ordinary failure an insurance adjuster could dismiss in an afternoon. She opened a formal attempted vehicular homicide case and obtained the Home Depot surveillance footage under a proper warrant, giving the evidence a cleaner legal foundation than Ray's initial retrieval. "I have seen brake tampering twice in 14 years, she told me in a small interview room that smelled of old coffee. Both times, it was family. I am sorry to tell you that is not unusual." Then she added, "I wish it were." Aldrich, the psychiatrist Margot had tried to weaponize, turned out to have more integrity than she expects. When Helen's office contacted him formally, he confirmed the voicemail and stated for the record that nothing in his brief contact with me, a single phone screening I agreed to only to close the issue, suggested impairment, a competency problem, or any risk. Without being asked, he wrote a letter stating that the request for an emergency evaluation appeared to be motivated by something other than clinical concern. That letter became Exhibit C. On the civil side, Helen filed a petition under the trust's forfeiture clause through the county probate court. She did it quietly and timed the filing so that it would not enter the public record until the case was airtight. "I have done this work for 30 years, Helen told me. "I have never enjoyed preparing a filing as much as I am going to enjoy this one." She assembled what she called the packet: the receipt, camera stills, phone records, Dr. Aldrich's letter, the HR call log, Detective Ford's preliminary findings, and Colleen's sworn affidavit establishing the timeline of Margot's hospital visits. 1 visit. 20 minutes. 5 days later, Margot returned and asked whether I had been discharged. The packet ran 12 paragraphs, and every paragraph was supported by a document bearing a date and a name. Some officials doubted me at first. A courthouse records clerk even said, not unkindly, "Sisters accusing sisters happens more often than you might think, and it is not always true." The remark hurt, but I understood it. That is how the system is supposed to work. Skepticism is not cruelty. It is what gives assembled evidence its meaning. The first time I sat across from Detective Ford, I felt as though I were the one on trial, even though I was the person who had been hurt. She asked the same questions in 3 different ways. Where had I parked? Who had access to the driveway? Had I argued with Margot recently? Was there anything in my mental health history that a defense attorney could use to cloud the facts? I understand now that Ford was pressure testing the case before allowing herself to believe it. Danny had done the same thing with the brake line before, saying the word cut aloud. At the time, however, it felt like one more person. I had to convince that I was not unstable. By my 4th meeting with Ford, something had changed in the way she spoke to me. She no longer sounded like someone merely recording a report. She sounded like someone building a case she intended to win. The plan was to let the civil petition and the criminal investigation move quietly in parallel until both were strong enough that Margot could not talk her way out of either one. But plans do not survive contact with charity galas. Margot had spent 8 months planning the Holloway Family Foundation Gala, the one event Helen believed she could not skip without alarming the exact social circle whose approval she needed most, especially while Brett's fund was collapsing publicly. There would be 200 guests, crystal stemware, and a string quartet in a hotel ballroom. It was the kind of evening around which Margot had built her adult identity. On the morning of the gala, Detective Ford called with information that changed the calculation. "We have a warrant ready to execute tomorrow morning," she said, "but there is a complication. Margot's attorney has filed for an emergency competency hearing against you at 8:00 a.m. tomorrow, using the same psychiatric argument. If that hearing occurs before the warrant is executed and before the forfeiture petition becomes public, the situation becomes messier. A judge who does not know the whole picture could temporarily freeze your assets pending evaluation. It would not last, but it could cost you weeks and humiliate you in precisely the forum Margot is counting on. I had 24 hours. The warrant was scheduled for the next morning. The competency hearing was scheduled for the next morning. The gala was that night. My hands began shaking again, not exactly from fear, but from something like an electrical current with nowhere to go. I remember standing barefoot in Ruth's kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath me, and thinking that it was tonight or never. If I waited for the machinery of the courts to move at its own pace, Margot would spend one more night as the untouchable golden daughter. I would spend one more night watching her escape accountability in front of 200 people who still believed I was unstable. Helen did not like the idea of confronting Margot outside a courtroom. "Evidence does not need a ballroom, Asia," she said. "It needs a judge." I answered, "I know, but she needs a room full of witnesses to believe her." so I am going to give her one, just not in the way she wants. Ray considered the idea as he considered everything else, without drama and with brutal practicality. If you do this, he said, you do it clean. Do not accuse her of anything in that room that you cannot support with a document in your hand. Let the evidence speak. Do not raise your voice. Whatever she does after that belongs to her. I did not sleep that night. I pressed a plain navy dress, the opposite of anything Margot would wear, placed Helen's 12-paragraph packet in a cream envelope, and sat at Ruth's kitchen table until 3 in the morning with Biscuit's head resting on my foot, rehearsing what I would and would not say. The Holloway Foundation Gala was held at the Kensington Grand, a hotel with the kind of chandeliers that seemed designed only to be photographed. I arrived at 7:40 p.m. 40 minutes after the doors opened, wearing my plain navy dress. From just inside the entrance, I watched Margot move through the crowd in crimson silk, glowing and working the room as if she had rehearsed every handshake in a mirror that morning, which, knowing her, she probably had. Her smile cracked for exactly half a second when she saw me. I caught the flicker and the tiny pause in her breath before the expression snapped back into place so quickly that I might have missed it if I had not been staring directly at her. Then she called my name in a loud, bright voice designed for the donors standing nearby. Asia, you came. I wouldn't miss it, I said, and allowed her to hug me, careful of the ribs still healing beneath the navy fabric. At around 8:15, she delivered a polished speech about family, resilience, the Foundation's mission, and the importance of showing up for the people you love. At one point, she asked me to stand and told the room how supported I had been throughout my recovery. 200 strangers turned toward me with warm, uncomplicated smiles. I gave them a small wave, sat down, and refused to let my face reveal anything. I waited until 9:40 after dinner, when the crowd had loosened into clusters near the bar and the string quartet had moved into something slower. I found Margot beside the auction table and quietly asked whether we could speak somewhere private. She hesitated. I watched her calculate whether refusing would look worse than agreeing. Then she led me into a small anteroom beside the ballroom, the sort of space hotels use for bridal parties and coat racks. I handed her the envelope. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." She did, and I watched her face as she read the forensic mechanics brake line report and the Home Depot receipt for $34.99. She saw her visa number ending in 4,471, the security camera image stamped 11:47 p.m., showing a figure matching her build walking toward my parents' driveway, and the phone record establishing that Brett had called her 17 minutes earlier for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Then came her call to Preston Cole about freezing the trust, and her voicemail to Dr. Aldrich's office. 12 paragraphs, every line sourced, every date confirmed. Her hands began to shake. I recognized the tremor because I had experienced the same thing when I first read Ray's folder. "You are making this up?" she said, but all of the brightness had vanished from her ballroom voice. "The police have the same documents, Margot," I replied. "Detective Ford has had them for 2 weeks. Helen filed the trust petition 11 days ago. A warrant will be executed tomorrow morning at 8:00. I kept my voice level and held on to Ray's instruction to let the documents speak. "I am not telling you anything you do not already know happened. I am telling you that other people know now too. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it was not triumph, at least not entirely. It was closer to grief. The particular grief of watching the last possible version of your sister, the one who might still have an explanation, disappear forever. For perhaps 3 seconds, standing in that anteroom with the string quartet drifting through the wall, I still wanted her to say something that would make it untrue. She did not. I did not directly see what happened next. I remained in the anteroom, and Margot moved faster than I expected from someone wearing heels and crimson silk. Over the following days, however, at least 4 people described the scene to me separately, and their accounts matched closely enough that I believed them. Margot burst back into the ballroom, waving the papers. Her voice rose far beyond anything she had used during her speech 20 minutes earlier. People repeatedly described her as screaming that I was destroying her, that I was unstable, and that I was jealous of her marriage, her home, and her life. 200 guests fell silent in the way a room does when something real interrupts something carefully performed. Helen stood first. I was told she rose calmly, buttoning her blazer as though she were about to offer a toast rather than end someone's evening. "Everything in that document has been independently verified," she said loudly enough to carry across the room, "and submitted in full to the Millbrook Police Department and the Suffolk County Probate Court." Then Colleen stood. She had driven 3 hours after her shift because I had quietly asked whether she would be willing to attend in case the evening unfolded the way I expected. "I was Asia's night nurse for 11 days after the crash," she said. "Margot visited once, for 20 minutes. I have the log." According to my cousin, who was present and sent me a play-by-play that I still have saved, Margot looked around the room. My cousin said she searched for one friendly face, anyone at all, a donor she had charmed, a board member she had courted, or even my mother, who sat 3 tables away. She found none. Margot turned, walked through the frosted glass doors at the rear of the ballroom, past the coat check and the valet stand, and, as far as anyone at the gala ever told me, Never entered that ballroom again. The next morning, at 8:04 a.m., Detective Ford executed the warrant at Margot and Brett's house. I was not there and did not request the detailed account I had received from the gala. Some things I did not need to know that closely. A few days later, Ford told me they had recovered hydraulic brake line cutters from a garage toolbox. The cutters still carried residue from the Home Depot price tag. They also found a laptop whose browser history showed searches for the trust's incapacity clause 4 days before my crash. Margot was arrested for attempted vehicular homicide and aggravated assault. The competency hearing she had sought against me, scheduled for that same 8:00 a.m. time slot, was withdrawn by her own attorney roughly 90 minutes after news of the warrant broke. Continuing to pursue it would have looked to any judge in the county like exactly what it was. 8 days later, the probate court granted Helen's forfeiture petition. Margot's half of the trust, worth more than $1 million, was reassigned to me in full. Under the clause, I also received reimbursement for the reasonable costs of proving the forfeiture, which covered Ray's retainer and more. Brett filed for divorce 11 days after the gala. I do not know all the details and have deliberately avoided asking. Curtis Doyle, the business partner who had accepted that useful beer from Ray, later said Brett told mutual friends, "I did not marry a woman who would do that." It struck me as a strange statement from a man who had spent years applying financial pressure to the marriage. But grief and shame make people say strange things. My parents never called to apologize. I include that because this is not a story in which everyone learns a lesson and the family heals before the ending. 3 weeks later, my mother sent one message. "We didn't know. You could have told us." I did not answer. I had told them. I told them with an accident report, a hospital wristband, and a 5-day silence that they filled with nothing at all. They had not wanted to know. There is a difference. And eventually you stop being responsible for teaching people that difference against their will. Technically, I turned 30 in a hospital cafeteria because Colleen was working that day. Ruth brought a small cake, and Danny arrived with a card that read, "Still breathing, still driving, still better than her." I laughed hard enough that my mostly healed ribs still objected. The trust cleared in full 4 months later. I used part of it to buy the apartment I had been renting, the one with the bad water pressure and the beautiful maple tree. I repaired the water pressure and kept the tree. Margot accepted a plea agreement in the criminal case, 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5, for attempted vehicular homicide, in exchange for the state not pursuing the more serious charge, carrying a longer minimum sentence. I did not attend the sentencing. Helen attended at my request, and later told me that Margot never looked up during the hearing. Sometimes I think about those 20 minutes, though not with the anger I once expected to carry forever. That anger has faded into something quieter, more like a scar than an open wound. I think about the 20 minutes, mostly because they turned out to be the most honest thing Margot ever gave me. 20 minutes was exactly the amount of time she needed to protect herself from my medical bills, and not 1 second more. The nurse's sentence has stayed with people more than almost any other part of this story. When Margot returned on the 5th day and asked whether I had already been discharged, Colleen told her, "You left 4 days ago, and you would know my condition if you had visited more than once." I was not in the room when she said it, but I have imagined the moment so many times that it feels as though I was. That sentence began the unraveling, long before the receipt, Ray's folder, or the ballroom. It was simply a tired nurse at the end of a long shift telling the truth to someone who expected her not to. Sometimes, that is all it takes.